the efforts in the California State University Student Association and auxiliary organizations of the Cal State system, and was a fellow under the Panetta Institute for Public Policy. Welcome, Bea. We have Eve. Garrow. I'm sorry, your name didn't make it on my sheet. Okay. I'm so sorry. Who is a homelessness policy analyst and advocate for the Dignity for All project at ACLU, Southern California. Prior to joining the ACLU, Eve was an assistant professor of social work at the University of Michigan, where she engaged in research and policy analysis on the implementation of social policies that target vulnerable populations, including persons who are homeless. Her research focused on disparate access to benefits and programs based on factors such as race and disability. Before that, Eve was a postdoctoral fellow at the UCLA NIMH AIDS training program, where she conducted research on the causes of unequal access to comprehensive and effective HIV test counseling for people receiving HIV testing. The underlying concern that has driven all of her work is the consequences of policy design and implementation for recipients and the development of policies that can more effectively advance human rights. Welcome, Eve. And then last but absolutely definitely not least, we have Cynthia Sanchez, who is the Director of Community Organizing at OCUUC. Born in Santa Ana and raised in Los Angeles, Cynthia is passionate about bringing equity to her community through organizing. Daughter of a single mom, Cynthia and her family have experienced many of the hardships she organizes to end. A graduate from the University of California in Berkeley, she began her organizing career in the city of Oakland at ACCE, followed by her start in faith-based organizing with the OCCCCO family in 2013. Welcome, Cynthia.
Thank you.
So I asked you, yes, welcome our volunteers. So I'm just gonna have you take over the mic and tell us a little bit more about your work, please.
Hi, I'm Milo with American Family Housing. I'm our chief executive. I've been working in building and operating affordable housing and supportive housing for about 20 years. And this last month marks my second year anniversary of American Family Housing. So I'm really happy to be with the organization and the great team we have there. I'm going to actually just hand the mic over to Bea, and Bea's going to actually talk more about our organization. And we're just glad to be here. Thank you for coming on a weekend to take the time to listen to us talk. Thank you for that.
So I have a thing about using mics, so can everyone hear me from the back?
No, we really need the mic.
Okay. I'm Bea Gadduang. I have been with American Family Housing for over a year now. I started with the organization as an intern, moving on to part-time and now eventually full-time work. American Family Housing has been around Orange County for over 35 years. We started in 1985. Our founder, Jim Miller, started the organization very modest beginnings from Santa Ana. He had used his own funds to create a shelter and a food distribution project out in the city of Westminster. And eventually, the organization grew to what it is today. And so to date, we have over 50 properties that we own and operate all over Orange County, Los Angeles, and San Bernardino counties. And with that, we also have over 200 units of affordable permanent supportive housing in our portfolio. And we have over 200 units that we are currently developing that's in our construction pipeline to date. American Family Housing, aside from development, also handles, we're a service provider. So we have intensive wraparound services and case management that we offer to our clients in both affordable and permanent supportive housing units. We host a children's program. We have a very robust children's program. And we do programs such as our Thanksgiving dinner that's held out at the city of Westminster, which this congregation is actually donated to, so thank you for that. That's on Thanksgiving. We feed over 1,000 families. So it's a lot, and aside from the dinner that we have, we actually go and deliver meals to those in our clients, the organization. Thank you.
Are we like sort of giving our little presentation right now, or just like introducing ourselves?
If you could introduce yourself.
Okay.
I know you've been here before,
Yeah.
and so now is the time for you to go ahead and you can give your presentation.
All right. So, hi everybody again, because I've been here I think a couple of times and I can see like a lot of familiar faces, and it's nice to be back. So once again, I'm Eve. I'm from the ACLU of Southern California. And just, you know, to talk about the vision and the goals of our project, we do see housing as a human right, as a right. We think that in a country as wealthy as this one, nobody should be living on the street, and everybody should have access, who qualifies, is eligible, should have access to permanent supportive housing or affordable housing. And that the reason that people are living on the streets or living in emergency shelters is because we haven't made that commitment. It takes money. And so like how do we know something's right? When you're eligible and you need it and you apply for it, you get it. What happens in this county instead and elsewhere around the country? When you're eligible and you need it, you're evicted or you end up on the street for some other reason, you oftentimes can't even get on an affordable housing list. They open like once every few years, exactly, thank you, once every few years for a couple of weeks, and then they close again. So if you're lucky, you'll maybe wait a year or 2 or 3 years to get on the list, if you can get on the list during that 2-week period. And then what happens? You wait between 5 and 10 years to get to the top of that list. So that's the reality out there. Given that reality, a lot of counties, including our own, have moved to emergency shelter as a solution. Is it a solution to homelessness?
No.
Those people are still homeless, right? Now they're just living in maybe a 200 bed or a 400. I won't even say bed because a lot of times it's a mat on the floor, other times it's a cot place. These shelters are unlicensed. They're not like a boarding care, let's say, or a skilled nursing facility. There's no state licensing for them. And so they tend to be unregulated. And we did a study of emergency shelters and recently released a report on some of the county-funded emergency shelters in Orange County. And we found that they were dangerously abusive sometimes, neglectful, and oftentimes just downright filthy, and that's really because of a lack of accountability, a lack of regulation. So that's one of the things that we would like to see in addition to making housing a right in this state, in this county, and in this country. We don't have a lot of time, but I just wanted to take us through a little thought here. So our previous supervisor, Todd Spitzer, who, what is he now? Does anyone know?
He's the DA.
Now he's the DA of Orange County. Came to your fair city and said some pretty inflammatory things. So I'm just, for those of you who can't read this, I'm going to read the bottom one. County Supervisor Todd Spitzer was at the Costa Mesa meeting to voice his opposition to, this is like, I took this out of a newspaper article, to Nelson's proposal and said the homeless population the proposed shelter aims to help are people who refuse services. And this is a quote from him. These are people who have terrible, terrible problems, sex offenders and drug addicts. So these are a very, very difficult population, he told the council. He also told the council, put people in the high desert and give them services where land is cheap and away from everyone else. So I kind of just wanted to spend 1 minute having people reflect on these statements and tell me the themes that you see coming out of them. And this is an elected official at the time, from our highest form of government in Orange County.
I lived in the high desert for 18 years, and the last several years, I have seen where they dump people in the high desert, and in the high desert, they do have 4 seasons, which we don't down here. And it snows in the wintertime, and it's very hot in the summertime. And they're forced to just kind of roam. There's not a lot of places that they can hide underneath. It's very sad up there.
Thank you. So I would say that one theme that comes out of his public comments is banishment or segregation of a population of people, right? What else? NIMBY, which I think Cynthia is going to talk about, and that's also a form of banishment, right? This group of people doesn't belong in our community. We need to move, they can't be in our community, they need to be somewhere else. Anything else? It's quite obvious, some of them are quite obvious, but.
Homeless are criminals.
Thank you. Anything else?
I don't know if this is out of place, but we're talking about politicians here. So Senator Morlock did propose that the Fairview Center in Costa Mesa be used. And my understanding, tell me if I'm wrong, and you guys may know more, was that he was absolutely beaten down by the NIMBYs. And this was a Republican senator too, by the way. So please comment on that.
Okay.
We don't recognize their humanity.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. So framing people as subhuman.
And it's not so much a theme about what they said, it's just a theme of there's a lot of stupidity out there.
Economic class gentrification.
And sort of class warfare.
Class warfare.
Sort of class warfare. Mark. One more.
Yeah, just the idea is the old saying, you can pay me now or you can pay me later. And if you don't deal with this situation now, it's going to be that much more. It's going to compound, it's going to grow in leaps and bounds, and you're going to have to pay for it later. So the longer the politicians do this, the worse off we are.
Right. So I'm just going to sort of, a couple of things. At the ACLU, once again, we don't believe that shelters are the answer. And the shelters that are out there now, many of them are substandard. And do we hear about that? Beyond the ACLU report, if any of you read it when it came out, there was, I'm just going to show you. I mean, we got pretty good coverage, international coverage and so forth. And, you know, and so like it was a big splash. And then after that, it just kind of like died down again. And do we care? Do we care that people are sort of getting, you know, segregated in these big sort of warehouse-like facilities, and oftentimes being mistreated? You know, elderly people, for example, who aren't getting the care that they need. Maybe not as much as we should, and maybe one of the reasons is the dehumanization of this group of people, which gets perpetuated by some of our county leaders. So I just wanted to say that Cynthia was with me at this Board of Supervisors meeting, and if you can't read it, there was a group of people who came from Irvine, and they organized really quickly and came to the Board of Supervisors to protest a shelter being put in their community. And some of the things they were saying that were on their signs were protect our community, protect our children. No tent city, keep Irvine safe, keep children safe. And you know, so those are two that I can read on there right now. That's a photograph that I took. So these are very similar themes to the themes that Todd Spitzer was pronouncing, right? These are dangerous people, and they don't belong in our community. We have to keep them out of our community. And then in a newspaper article, a couple of people who attended were quoted saying, one said, "I just don't want to be near the homeless," and another said, I don't really know where they can go, but Irvine is beautiful and we don't want to get destroyed. So the rhetoric around emergency shelters, even though we don't believe that emergency shelter is an answer, and we would much prefer that our elected officials would be appropriating and committing funding to permanent supportive housing and affordable housing, which integrates people into the community. You're no longer experiencing homelessness, and you have an apartment that you can afford if you need it for the rest of your life. Although we would much prefer that, and not like go through this middle ground of putting people in emergency shelters that are unregulated, sometimes for years, because we're not committing funding to affordable housing. I think what this also brings up is this very dangerous, this incredibly dangerous rhetoric and practice, and also practices that are like revealed by the politics around emergency shelters. So people who think about this more than I do talk about like the stages of oppression, from like, you know, how oppression starts of a particular group to how it ends. And it starts with classification, the homeless, sort of like a bunch of different people, right? But now they're classified as a member of a group, as diverse as they are. Second, symbolization. How do we identify these people? What do we think about them? 3, dehumanize the group. They're animals, they're criminals and drug addicts, they're sex offenders. I'm having a phone call with a supposed advocate from Bakersfield who is completely sure that 25% of the people experiencing homelessness in Bakersfield are sex offenders. And I said, where did you get that? You know, and so she wants to talk to me, you know, about those concerns. And then organization. If you're going to oppress a group, it requires organization. That can be vigilante groups. That can be organizing in this way. And it can also be the government organizing to clear people off of the streets and banish them, put them somewhere, whatever. Polarization, so elected officials doing what Todd Spitzer was doing, inciting fear and hatred, us against them. They don't belong here, they're not part of our community. And then actually segregating people from society, which he recommended, right, that we do. And then, of course, actually banishing people, or worse, exterminating people, is sort of the end final, you know, result. And then after that becomes denial and victim blaming. Well, it wasn't us, you know, we had to get rid of these people because of all of these qualities that they have. So what experts say, you know, the farther along we let this go, along this spectrum, the more difficult it becomes to stop the train. In the early stages, which I feel like we're at right now, we're at early stages of sort of stigmatizing, suggesting that we segregate and banish people, but not actually doing it. That's the time to speak out, because that's when it's easiest to reverse course. But it takes people knowing what the situation is and then speaking out at Board of Supervisors meetings, at your city council meetings, like this one that Todd Spitzer showed up to. So I think Cynthia is going to talk a little bit more about civic engagement and what we can all do to get involved. And I work very closely with her as an organizer for Housing as a Human Right, Orange County, which is a group that the ACLU belongs to. So this is serious stuff. And it's serious not just because people are suffering and living on the streets, but because of the politics around it.
Thank you.
Thank you, Eve. So when I was thinking about what would be useful for this awesome congregation, I was thinking about the fact that Unitarians, I believe, play a really critical role in raising the awareness and the hope and the future of Orange County. I think the role that the Unitarian Universalist Church plays in ending homelessness is also really, really important, which is why I was very excited to be here. As Eve mentioned, NIMBYism, right? NIMBYs, not in that backyard folks, are people that through their numbers and through their voice, they have the ability to stop and end projects that are meant to advance ending homelessness in Orange County. And as I wish we could go back to Eve's slide where we see the picture from Irvine. So that day, folks from Housing is a Human Right, we were there at the Board of Supervisors action, and we were there to ask the city of Irvine to support us in ending homelessness by funding housing, but also, right, to be supportive of the effort of sheltering folks who need immediate shelter. And that day, hundreds and hundreds of people came in buses. They paid for buses to drive them over to the Board of Supervisors. We've never seen them before at a Board of Supervisors meeting.
Never see them again.
We'll never see them again. And so much of the rhetoric was incredibly toxic, as you've already mentioned. A personal anecdote for me is I was talking to folks openly in the audience about just facts around housing, right? About permanent supportive housing and how it's the evidence-based way of ending homelessness in Orange County. And a gentleman just got super, super triggered, and he walked up to me this close and he told me to shut up. I felt very threatened. I thought he was gonna punch me. And luckily, another person who was there that day, he got in between us, and the guy stepped away. But I say this because NIMBYism is one of the reasons why we're not successfully ending homelessness in Orange County. And I want us to think about the role that the faith community plays in mitigating NIMBYism and in transforming the way those people, right, think about the homeless. One of the challenges in today's society is just how polarized we are, right? That those are the conservative folks that are nothing like us, and if there were only more of us, the world would be different. But as I think about that, I think about one of the roles that OCCO, my organization, plays or has played in Orange County in ending that divisiveness and how that could be a hope for the future. So most recently, we worked on a campaign called Deep Canvassing. And what we did is we put together a team of young people who care about the country and who care about immigration specifically. And these folks together, they trained to talk to conservative and moderate voters in Orange County, mostly white, mostly middle class, about the topic of immigration. They knocked on their doors, on the doors of, like I mentioned, white middle class folks, and they asked them what their views were about undocumented immigrants. As you can imagine, right, the conversations oftentimes were unkind. And when our folks would share their stories about immigration, they were not received very well. But a lot of those conversations were quite the opposite. When we knocked on those doors and we asked them where they stood from a 0 to a 10, 0 being I'm 100% in favor of deportations, of our local police playing a stronger role in deportations versus a 10, I'm completely against it. Folks, through the power of us sharing our stories and having conversations about compassion, change from being a 0 to being a 3, or some folks from being a 3 to being a 7. And as part of that study, which was in partnership with the University of Stanford and UC Berkeley, we were able to measure the impact of those conversations. And we surveyed those folks after we had those conversations with them at the doors. And after a week, they were still more supportive of undocumented immigrants. After 3 weeks, they were still more supportive. And the last time that we've tested them, after 6 months, they still demonstrated growth in their understanding of undocumented immigrants and some lenience towards policies that, that uphold their dignity of life. I mention this because I think the topic of immigration is not so different from homelessness. I think there's ways that we can look at the NIMBY community, right? At those hundreds of folks that say really toxic and negative things about people experiencing homelessness, and look at them in the way that we would look at our brothers and sisters in this congregation and say, how can I speak to these folks in a way that they can be transformed? And I think some of those tools are around sharing your story, right? And not being afraid about talking about issues of poverty and disenfranchisement and compassion, right? We sometimes think, well, all it takes is the political will. But the truth is that our legislators and our representatives are only as strong as the crowd that's in front of them, right? If every single person in the room is telling them not to do something, chances are they're not going to do it because they care about staying in office. So changing NIMBYism is about changing minds and hearts. For folks who want to take some resources home, I brought the results of our project with University of Stanford and Berkeley about changing minds and hearts in the immigrant community. And I also brought, this is from 2017, but United Way put together a report on the cost of homelessness. And it has some nice little facts about people experiencing homelessness in Orange County, right? That many of them, that most of them, in fact, are from this community. Mm-hmm. We often think about people experiencing homelessness are outsiders who are here threatening our community. The reality is that many of them, most of them, are from Orange County and have been displaced by the housing crisis. And I say this because as we're having these conversations, these heart-to-heart conversations with folks who we perceive to be NIMBYs in our communities, it's not just enough to say the facts. It's not just enough to yell and say, hey, I'm right and you're wrong and you're being close-minded about this. We can't use facts to appease concerns. But the real transformation comes from having deep and honest conversations about the things that are impacting our community, that are impacting our lives, and hearing those concerns from folks with an open mind. So I'll stop there from now, and then during the Q&A, I think there will be room for deeper discussion.
So before we dive into Q&A, I did want to ask, because Cynthia and Dr. Garrow have spoken about permanent supportive housing, so how many in the room know what permanent supportive housing is? Okay, so for those of you that do know, don't say anything. So a lot of people have this misconception about what permanent supportive housing looks like, and that's really what NIMBYism is focused around, right? It's these misconceptions that we really don't educate ourselves enough about. And permanent supportive housing, to those looking from the outside, they think that it's a gathering of all these homeless people who are using drugs or are sex offenders, and that they are just hanging around, loitering around. But permanent supportive housing does not look anything like that. It very much so integrates people back into society. And from our experience and our developments, permanent supportive housing, you can drive by a street and it could just look like a regular apartment complex or a regular home. But there are supportive services attached to that, and that's what people don't understand. And so when you go out and speak to different community members, these are things that you could tell them. And permanent supportive housing, people don't understand that it decreases the cost of homelessness, and homelessness is very much relational. It doesn't just impact the person who's experiencing homelessness, but it also impacts our communities directly. And Orange County spent $300 million during that year when this cost study was published to solve homelessness, and help, like the healthcare industry in Orange County spent approximately $120 million. Wow. To treat those who were suffering from homelessness, because people on the streets do suffer from complex physical and behavioral issues. And so that looks very different for them, and permanent supportive housing can decrease that by half. So those living on the streets, it costs us $100,000 to support them while they're on the street, but in permanent supportive housing, that number is actually half. So it drops to about $50,000 a year. So Milo, you can speak on some of those if you'd like.
Yeah, thank you for bringing that up. I'm glad you said that. You know, it's really important because all these conversations about shelters and perceptions but what we know is shelters are very valuable. They keep people safe. If you've been homeless for a year, you'll never be the same again. That is half of our population in Orange County that's homeless has been homeless for more than a year or something like that. So these social shelters do serve a very important purpose. But what they've shown over the last few decades is they help manage the problem. They don't create structural change that ends it, that addresses the long-term problem. And that's where supportive housing comes in. Rental housing with services where people who really need help to stay in housing, so they don't lose their housing again, are given the chance to have an apartment, key, a lock, a broom, a bedroom, a bed. And the difference though is we really connect them with services, particularly medical. Healthcare issues is our problem. Physical disability, mental health issues, that's the problem. That is the problem. And in that context, we support our tenants through what we call wraparound services, because we wrap around them. They don't come to us, we go to them. And then when they run into trouble, when they fall behind their rent, when they don't pay the bills, when they bother their neighbor, right? Because that's a big thing when apartments is got to follow the terms of your lease. We step in, and rather than the consequence being that they go homeless again for another 5-year cycle, we step in and we support them in getting back on track. And it's extraordinarily cost effective, and it works really well. And just in my career, I've overseen about 1,000 supportive housing units. This is up in LA County for a few years that were all have been around for more than a decade. And then today we have a number of developments in operations that we oversee. It's remarkable that we really just are fine as a neighbor. We work hard to make the buildings really nice. We work really hard to make sure the neighbors next door to us, if they have any concerns, will feel comfortable calling us. But really the concerns never manifest, that they don't. And this is where the conversation will go. But we really need to get more more rental housing that targets formerly homeless households built. We just need to get it coming. You know, not all at once. We just need to keep it coming. Keep it coming. We're so far behind.
I guess I'll just follow up by saying, well, our report shows that oftentimes these shelters are not safe places for people to be, and so we need to push our elected officials for higher standards and in a system of accountability to hold the shelters accountable to those standards. Licensing could be one way, because right now there's no licensing for emergency shelter. They could be much safer, some are much safer, some are not. So when a system of care is unregulated, it's just sort of a crapshoot, and it depends upon the provider. The other thing, and this is in the report that we released. So the county opened a shelter at the time, and it may still be, was the county's largest shelter. It holds like over 400 people. It's in an old bus terminal. And over a 2-year period, they were able to connect a percentage of the people. This is not a percentage of all the people who were there, who stayed in the shelter over those two years, because some people just left, some were evicted, and the shelter staff didn't know where they went. But among the people who were actually connected to another living situation, and that was documented, can anybody guess the percentage over a 2-year period in the county's largest shelter that were connected to permanent supportive housing? Just take a guess, somebody.
5%. 5?
5. Bingo. You won the award. 5%. 5% of the people who stayed in the shelter and were connected to another living situation were connected to permanent supportive housing. And that goes to show, the folks to my left are absolutely right. This is the solution. This ends homelessness. A person is no longer homeless now. They're not living in a shelter. They're not living on the street. They're living in their own affordable permanent apartment. The funding, it is such an underfunded program that when I go out and talk to people sometimes experiencing homelessness, they don't even know about it. They don't even think that actually, they think that living in their own home again someday is just like out of the question. Because it's so rare. They've never met anybody who has permanent supportive housing. So this is sort of like, if we think of homelessness as the crisis of our time, and if we actually want to solve it, we really need to hold our elected officials accountable. I want to say one more thing about our Board of Supervisors. They have about $1 billion discretionary budget. That's not their entire budget. That's just the budget that they control. It mostly comes from property taxes. Guess how much they committed to permanent supportive housing in the last budget cycle? Cynthia knows, because we always come out during the budget hearings and we advocate.
Under
$5 million. $5 million.
Wow.
And that's probably only because we were out there. We brought impacted folks, people experiencing homelessness, people who were doubled and tripled up in market rate apartments, talking about the harm that overcrowding does to their children, and asking, urging, demanding, pleading with the Board of Supervisors to please commit more of their discretionary budget to affordable housing and permanent supportive housing. Because they commit that funding to other things. For example, a state-of-the-art animal shelter, new animal shelter in Tustin with heated floors and soundproof walls so that when dogs bark, you know, they don't bother one another. And that's important. But the fact that we have people sleeping on the street, that's important too. $30 million in Lisa Bartlett's district to beautify Dana Point Harbor.
Oh.
You could say that's important, but what's more important? So what we always say is that budgets are moral documents. If you analyze and read a budget and see where the money goes, you understand the moral values of the board of your elected officials, people who live in Orange County voted for. Because it shows what they value enough to pay for and what they don't value and refuse to pay for. And if this is the humanitarian crisis of our time, I think that the county should be pitching in more.
As we keep in mind both targeting our legislators and having open and honest conversations with folks in our families and our communities who might be NIMBYs, I think it's important to think about what Eve mentioned regarding shelters, right? Shelters make it incredibly difficult for folks to receive the appropriate health care, especially